let a few more attendees show up for tonight's workshop. So thank you for your patience. Time to allow for more attendees to show up.
Yeah, we're up to 12 now. So
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, they're coming in slowly. So maybe it's,
Oh,
maybe we'll wait till 6:05 and then we'll get started.
okay, yeah. Let's go ahead and do that.
Okay.
So at 6:05. Without hearing any objections, we'll go ahead and kick off the workshop, tonight's workshop. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Scully. I'm the planning manager for the city of Redondo Beach. And I want to welcome everybody to our first parking strategies community workshop for the Artesia and Aviation Corridors Area Plan. We refer to it as the AACAP. You'll be hearing that term a lot tonight. Before we go ahead and dive into the actual presentation, we've got a slide deck for you tonight to kind of walk through all the parking issues. I want to do a couple of introductions of the team that's here tonight, the panelists from the city and our consultants that are with us tonight. So from the city, we've got Lena Portalesi. She is our planning analyst, and she'll be handling logistics of tonight's meeting, raised hands for comments, things like that. Thank you very much, Lena. We also have with us tonight our recently hired Waterfront and Economic Development Director, Greg Kapovich. And we're really happy to have Greg. Greg has an extremely strong planning background. Greg is going to be taking a leadership role with the further implementation of the AACAP as we move forward. Of course, planning will be working really closely with Greg, but we're really happy to have somebody with the experience he does. And before I turn it over for the presentation, I'll give you a chance, Greg, to say a few things if you want to introduce yourself in any way. But so that's our city. We've got Lena and Greg. Our subject matter experts here tonight with respect to parking are Nico Boyd and Marta Palavin. If I'm saying that right?
Yeah.
Sorry about that, if not. And they're from Fair and Pierce. Fair and Pierce has been on board and working on the AACAP since it first was developed, back in the very, very beginning of the process, back in like 2017, I want to say. So they're very familiar with parking and the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. So we're in really good hands with Fair and Piers. We also have with us tonight Shannon McAlpin from our CEQA consultant from Rincon. There's not a lot we can do today that doesn't involve CEQA. So we've got our consultant on board in case we have any questions related to the California Quality Act. So before I go ahead and turn it over, I just want to say, give just a quick little update, a little context on where we are with the AACAP right now. It's been through quite a process in order to be developed. It was a 2 to 3 process of development. It was ultimately adopted by the City Council on December 8th, 2020. Once adopted, it was then the next phase is which we're in now is actually implementing. And the way the city is implementing the AACAP is integrating it into the city's zoning ordinance. So as a result of that, and we're working on that process now, it's what we've discovered is this project has kind of got 2 parts to it. One, all the amendments to the zoning ordinance we're going to need to do in order so that the zoning ordinance is consistent with all the design guidelines and development standards and other implementation measures in the AACAP. So we have that tracking separately from what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is the parking strategies, which is another component of the AACAP. And we're going to have to do a series of amendments to the city's parking development standards in order for it to be more consistent with the AACAP. And I can tell you personally, I've been with the city now about 7 years, and the reason parking is so critical to the revitalization of the Artesian aviation corridors is because I can tell you on many occasions over the years, we've at the city, we've had to say no to some revitalization efforts, essentially businesses that we really would like to see on the boulevard come in, but they can't meet our parking standards. So we've had to say no. So, that's something, the knee-jerk reaction is, well, why don't we just reduce the parking standards? But it's a very tricky endeavor. We don't want to create then some unintended consequences with spillover parking into our residential neighborhoods. So there's a balanced and a very thoughtful way we need to go about it. And that's what we're going to start working on tonight through this workshop. So I think we've got this presentation. It's really kind of interesting. This will be the first time we've done this. We've had many workshops, but this workshop will actually have an opportunity where we're asking for input from you that are attending tonight. And we're going to have some polling questions, and you'll be able to respond or answer the questions in real time, and we'll see the results in real time. So we're anxious to see how that works. Additionally, the polling questions you have tonight, we've also converted those to a Survey Monkey. We're going to put those on the city's website. It'll be on our AACAP landing page, and that'll be available for if any of you have technical difficulties. Oh, okay. Yes. So we've got this polling exercise you'll be going through tonight will also be available on the city's website as a survey. So we'll have that for the next week. So if you're having some technical difficulties, you'll be able to take the survey online too. So before I turn it over to Nico and Marta, Councilman Member Obaji is available and would like to make some introductory remarks as well. So with that, if you want to go ahead and invite our council member, that'd be great, Lena.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Sorry about that. I didn't know whether I should be here and speaking or not, but in any event, exactly what Manager Scully said is precisely right, which is that restaurants, businesses, new businesses that want to come to Artesia Boulevard. You see a lot of the vacancies currently on Artesia Boulevard. They go, they're interested, they can pay the rent, and then they go down to the planning desk and try to make sure that their business would be able to open up under their use, and what else they need to do to set up their business. And they realize that they're not going to be able to, based on the lot sizes, park the business because the parking requirements are just too big. And historically, I think the way that we got to where Artesia is right now, with a bunch of strip malls, and rather than the storefronts being on the front of the street, they're kind of set back with parking lots in front of them, is because the parking requirements were historically so onerous. My viewpoint when I ran, and since I've come into office, as far as directing policy, has been to bank and use the fact that Artesia Boulevard is located between two very dense residential neighborhoods, north and south of Artesia Boulevard. And south of Artesia Boulevard, we got 3 on lots, and actually same thing north of Artesia, if not more than that, with all the apartment complexes and 2 on lots, where a lot of folks living in a small space. So it stands to reason that if new businesses opened up on Artesia Boulevard, that people would walk and bike from these residential neighborhoods that surround it and are very affluent. They'd walk and bike to spend their dollars there on Artesia Boulevard. So that's why they're doing the outreach. I'm really appreciative of them doing this outreach. They need to develop the environmental impacts of changing the parking requirements and reducing them. So that's what the purpose of this is, and also understand how you use Artesia Boulevard, how you get there, and whether you visit more than one store when you go, and so on and so forth. So thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. So I think with that, thank you, Councilmember Obaji. We will go ahead and turn it over to Marta and Nico, and you can teach us all we need to know about parking.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so hi everyone. Again, I'm Nico Boyd. I'm joined tonight by my colleague Marta Polovin. We're transportation planners with Fair & Peers. And what we're going to be covering tonight is a series of options for managing parking in the Artesia and aviation corridors in line with the vision of the AACAP. So a quick note about the AACAP. What is it? I presume that if you're here, you're probably already pretty familiar with what it is, but I'll give a quick recap just in case. So the AACAP was adopted in 2020, and basically what it does is it provides a roadmap to transform the Artesia and aviation corridors into the main street of North Redondo. So to achieve that, the plan outlines strategies to revitalize the corridors, and that includes things like creating engaging public spaces, improving bike and transit access, facilitating and encouraging redevelopment and reinvestment in private property, and then of course, rethinking how parking is accommodated in the corridors, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So as a sort of outgrowth of the AACAP, what we're working on now is developing a parking implementation plan. And that plan is basically going to guide how parking gets accommodated in the future. And this workshop is a really key part of the process for how we're going to get there. So what are we going to cover tonight? We're going to start by presenting the results of the most recent parking study that was conducted for the AACAP to show, what are the existing trends, what are the potential needs in the future. Then we're going to review some of the various options that we've identified for parking and mobility strategies in the corridors, and that all comes directly out of the AACAP. We're going to talk about best practices that we've identified from other communities. And then finally, we're going to receive input from all of you on the implementation options that you would prefer to guide the implementation of the parking implementation plan. So one thing that I want to note that was already mentioned, but we are going to be including polling questions throughout the presentation to collect your input actually as we're moving through the slides. So when we get to the first polling question, we're going to provide some instructions for how to participate, how to submit your answers. And then at the end, we're going to leave time for additional questions and any comments that maybe don't get answered in the course of the presentation. So just to reiterate, we're going to start off with the overview of the parking analysis that we've done, and we're going to talk about what our projections of future parking needs might look like. We're going to talk through the strategies that have been proposed for managing parking in the corridors. We're going to talk about best practices from other communities that we might consider, and then we're going to collect your feedback throughout the presentation and then afterwards as well. All right, so let's dive into the first section of the presentation, the parking analysis. So in 2019, we did a study of parking supply and utilization in the corridors for both on-street parking and off-street parking. And we found that the existing supply is actually pretty underutilized. An area that we would consider quote unquote efficiently parked would have about 85% of spaces occupied during the period of kind of peak demand. But what we found was that on-street parking was only about 68% occupied and off-street parking was about 50% occupied. So definitely a lot of parking supply available that isn't currently getting used. For people who aren't familiar, the Urban Land Institute is a group that does a lot of research on urban planning related issues, and that includes parking. And every several years, they produce data that basically quantifies what peak parking demand looks like for a wide range of different land uses. So based on the mix of uses that we currently have in these corridors, the peak parking demand that we actually observed when we went out and collected counts was less than half of what the Urban Land Institute would have predicted for the area. So basically the key takeaway is that there's a lot of parking that's not currently being utilized. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Marta, and she's going to walk you through the methodology for how we did the parking analysis.
Sure, so I'll dive into that methodology. So the first thing that we did was review previous and existing parcel data. And using our parking analysis from 2019, we reviewed total inventory, total parking spaces, and observed occupancy, how many of those parking spaces were used. For instance, we also added in the additional supply to reflect the newer CVS development. For future analysis, city staff identified key parcels in the AACAP's activity nodes that would absorb potential future development. And after that review, we used the Urban Land Institute's most up-to-date model to calculate existing and future parking demand from target land use ratios. So some key considerations for our future analysis include, number one, making sure that redevelopment occurs around activity nodes. Number two, making sure that growth is reflective of the 0.5 to 0.6 FAR ACAP target, basically a 20% increase in allowable buildable area. Number three, making sure that office and dining were the only land uses introduced by the corridors, or introduced on the corridors. And as mentioned before, city staff picked key parcels. And from there, we assumed that those parcels would be 50% office and 50% dining, like sit-down restaurant, not fast casual. And those parcels that we selected would grow about 20% to reflect the FAR changes. So a key part of our analysis was to evaluate future mobility trends that may affect parking demand. This includes things like AVs, like self-driving cars, TNCs, Uber and Lyft, transit recovery and growth, and so on and so forth. So for instance, the more autonomous vehicles, AVs there are, the need for parking likely goes down as they can just drive around and not need to park. We created 3 scenarios, which would include a higher parking demand future, a mid parking demand future, and lower parking demand future. A higher parking demand future assumes business as usual. With more development, you're going to need more parking, and that's that. A lower demand future assumes greater mobility changes, like more people walking and biking, or more people using autonomous vehicles, Uber, Lyft. So more people using those services, the less you're probably going to need parking.
Okay, so let's talk through the results of the parking analysis. There's a lot of information packed into this table, so I'm going to try to highlight the key points. So in the columns on the left, we're showing the existing supply. So we actually went out into the corridors and we collected counts to find out how many existing spaces are there. So you can see in that column all the way on the left for off-street parking, we have almost 2,200 spaces. And then for on-street, we have almost 700 spaces. So combined, that gets us to almost 2,900 total parking spaces. And then the column that's kind of in the middle there, the light green heading, that's the observed demand. So we actually went out during those peak periods and we counted of the available supply, how many of those spaces are actually being used? Is there somebody parked there? So for a weekday, we saw almost 1,600 cars parked. And then for the weekend, it was about 1,400. The columns on the right, that's the future parking analysis. And that corresponds with those three scenarios that Marta just described. So for the higher demand future, that's basically where we're assuming business as usual. So parking demand is going to continue to grow over time. The lower demand future is where we might see investment in alternative modes of transportation in the future, greater use of Uber and Lyft, autonomous vehicles, more people walking, biking, taking transit. So the demand for parking is lower. And then the middle scenario is kind of a hybrid of the two. It splits the difference. We see some growth in parking demand, but a little bit of that is offset by all those alternative mobility strategies. So really the key takeaway for this slide is the two rows at the bottom. So for the higher demand future, if we were to assume, for example, that through the implementation of the AACAP, all of the existing on-street parking gets converted into off-street parking, we would have a shortfall of 500 spaces. So basically 500 additional spaces would need to be constructed probably in a parking garage to accommodate that demand. For that middle scenario, the shortfall is 290 spaces. So that's the number of additional spaces that would have to be built to accommodate the demand. And then for the lower demand scenario, the existing supply is enough. We wouldn't have to build any additional off-street parking. If we don't assume that the existing on-street parking is going to be converted into off-street, then it doesn't really matter which scenario you look at. We're not going to have to build any additional parking no matter what. So key takeaways on the next slide, just to reiterate that for that maximum kind of higher demand scenario, if the on-street parking gets converted into off-street, we would still have that shortfall of 500 spaces. So that's the additional spaces that would need to be constructed. So in the next sections, we're going to talk about specific strategies and measures for managing parking, potentially increasing the supply. So there's a few different buckets. There's a range that we're looking at. On one end of that spectrum, we have directly providing additional supply, which is basically just building more parking spaces to accommodate the demand. On the other end of the spectrum, we have implementation of management strategies. So really the idea with those is that we're trying to balance the supply with the demand so that we don't necessarily have to build additional parking. And then there's also the hybrid of the two. Maybe we invest a little bit in building some additional parking, but then we balance that out with strategies to manage the demand so that we don't have to build quite so much. So now we're going to get into our first polling question, very exciting. So for this exercise, everybody's going to need a web browser. You can do it on your phone. If you're at your computer, you can just do it through your web browser there. So what you want to do is navigate to menti.com. That's up at the top of the screen. And when you get to menti.com, there's a text box that's going to prompt you to input that code. Type that code in, and you should see this question pop up, and you'll be able to select and submit your answer. And the question that we're asking is, do you want to see investments in increasing parking or increasing mobility options? And that kind of lines up with those scenarios that we just talked through. So if we're thinking about that higher demand scenario, do we want to invest in building more parking to accommodate that demand? Or if we're thinking, maybe the lower demand scenario is more likely, do we want to invest more in mobility options?
Nico, if I may, I know we have attendees here, but as well, this is streaming live. So anyone that's watching at home on either a streaming service or on, Spectrum or Verizon, feel free to go to that website as well. Jump on your, laptop or what have you, a computer, go on to the website, use that code and take the survey, take the poll as we're doing it too, even if you're not part of the actual Zoom meeting.
Thanks for that. Okay, so we had a little bit of a 50-50 split between the first two columns for a second, but now it looks like we have a winner. We'd like to see greater investment in mobility options. So let's just give it maybe another minute, see if additional responses trickle in, and then we'll move on to the next polling question.
And
Nico, if you could, Nico, when we get the result, whatever it is, could you talk just a little bit about what it means to see greater investment in mobility options? How does that kind of play out?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're actually going to talk a lot about what those specific mobility strategies are later in the presentation.
Oh, okay.
We'll cover those in some detail. But as opposed to investing in increasing the parking supply, we would invest in strategies that make it easier to access the corridors by biking, by walking, by taking transit, maybe incentives for using things like Uber and Lyft so that you can arrive at the corridors and not have to park. Those and several other strategies are among what we're going to be talking about later in the presentation.
Mhm.
Excellent.
And then Nico, we do have a question in our Q&A. It's just asking if our assumption is regarding on-street parking is that it would convert to off-street if the on-street parking lane is removed for a bike lane. So I'm not sure if the analysis addressed that, but having to do with if we do install a bike lane and the impact of the loss of those off-street parking spots.
Yeah, that's a great point. Installing more bike infrastructure can definitely impact parking and reduce that in some places. So I think we would want to think about coupling strategies like increasing bike access and bike infrastructure with strategies to offset that loss in parking so that people who do drive can still find a place to park.
And just a quick note, you can see the number of folks who have voted already in the bottom right corner.
Awesome. Looks like we've kind of stabilized, so maybe we can move on to the next one.
Great.
Excellent.
So to the question that was just asked, would you support converting on-street parking to off-street parking? So that's really in line with that higher demand future that we were talking about, where, as that on-street parking gets converted, if that happens, we would end up with a shortfall. So we would need to build some additional spaces in a garage. Looks like we have 13 responses.
Mhm.
How many did we have on the previous question?
I think 29.
All right, let's see if we can get close to 29.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I think I know what the consensus is. So it seems like we have the majority opinion is not in support of making that conversion, but it's close.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay.
Interesting.
All right. So that concludes the first section of the presentation. Now we're going to move into the mobility and parking strategies that actually came out of the AACAP.
Okay.
So this is the list of measures that were identified. So we have shared parking solutions, reduce parking requirements, park once public parking garages, remove on-street parking, pick up and drop off zones for TNCs, which is Uber and Lyft, and autonomous vehicles, streetlit public space, bike and mobility device parking, transit curb extensions, activity nodes, metered parking, and in-lieu fees. So Marta is going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail to explain what they are. And we have polling questions sprinkled throughout this section. So make sure you don't close that browser window.
Great. Thank you, Nico. So the first one is shared parking solutions. What is shared off-street parking? It's basically allowing different uses like businesses to share a parking facility. For example, a coffee shop is pretty busy in the morning, but probably less so at night, versus a restaurant might be busier in the evening and less so in the morning. And the time frame on this is short to medium term, and the relative cost is on the lower end. The next one is reducing parking requirements. And so parking requirements are basically the minimum amount of parking, say a restaurant, a business, a land use needs to provide. And current requirements might not reflect existing or future parking trends. So we can tailor requirements to right-size parking for efficient use. And this can also allow us to use up underutilized parking throughout the corridors. The time frame on this is short to medium term, and the relative cost is on the lower end.
All right, so we have our next polling question. Do you support flexibility in parking requirements using shared parking and or reducing minimum parking requirements? And I just want to touch on that concept of shared parking again, because it can be a little bit tough to understand. So the idea is that, say, for example, you have two businesses that are next door neighbors, and maybe one of them is a coffee shop and one of them is a sit-down restaurant that specializes in dinner service. Those two businesses are not going to have the same peak for parking demand. The coffee shop is going to be busier in the morning. The restaurant is going to be busier in the evening. So instead of requiring both of those businesses to provide their own kind of minimum parking supply, they can just share the same supply, and that reduces the amount of parking that needs to be built. And this one, I think we have a very clear winner. Most people are in support.
Great. We'll just wait a few more seconds.
Nico, if I may, before you can see a lot of support for this, and we actually have the ability to do it now. It's just the way in which it's constructed in the zoning ordinance. It requires the actual, encumbrance on the neighbor's property to allow for the neighbors to park on his property or her property. And that's where it becomes an impediment. It tends to fail because that adjacent property owner isn't willing to actually record against his property those dedicated spaces to be used for the adjacent business. It's one thing we're probably going to have to dig a little deeper into this. It's definitely something we can see gets a lot of support, and we actually do have a provision to try to implement it. It just tends, because it's such a commitment by that adjacent property owner, the way it's written now, it's usually, I don't know how many of these we actually even have, if any, because of that. So maybe there's a way we can relax that requirement and, into something that doesn't require an actual recordation of a document.
Mm-hmm.
Just a lease agreement, between owners or something. So hopefully we can find some best practices out there, a way to do this a little bit more informally.
Yeah, that's something that we can definitely dig into and research. Thanks for that context.
All right. We ready?
Yeah, I think
All
so.
Right. We're moving on. So the next strategy is the park once public parking garages. So the idea behind this one is that rather than going to, say, the grocery store and parking, and then going to the dry cleaners and then parking, you just park once in a shared public parking garage and you can visit both in one trip. So garages can serve uses within a reasonable walking distance, like a quarter of a mile. A couple of things to consider, as we've already discussed, they can help offset loss of on-street parking for other mobility investments, like a loading zone or a bike lane. They can be funded by in-lieu fees. In-lieu fees are basically where the developer pays into a general city fund rather than building on-site parking. The dollars go into public lot rather than a private lot. The time frame on this one is mid to long term, and the relative cost can be on the higher end. And just a note that downtown Ventura has already implemented something similar to this. And then the next one is removing on-street parking, with the goal of freeing up curb space that can serve the community's priorities, like loading zones or outdoor dining, and so on and so forth. And this can go hand in hand with building a public parking garage to offset any of those parking losses. The time frame on this is midterm to long term, and the relative cost is on the higher end.
Okay, next question. Do you support investment in public parking garages to make curb space available for other uses? I don't want to call it too soon. But yeah, it generally seems like we have support for this. And this connects back to that kind of higher demand future that we were talking about with, conversion of on-street parking into off-street parking frees up that space on the curb so that it can be used for other purposes. So that's really what we're getting at here. Okay, yeah, seems like we've stabilized. So more than 50% support.
Okay, we are moving on. So the next series of measures are more mobility oriented. So this one is about providing curb space for Uber, Lyfts, and autonomous vehicles. As activity increases throughout the corridors, demands for the curbs will rise. So such zones, like zones for TNCs and AVs, can help with safety and efficiency. And additionally, these zones can be reconfigured as needed. If there's less Uber activity, the zones could decrease and vice versa. The time frame is longer term and the relative cost is on the lower end. The next strategy is streetlight public space. So streetlets are the conversion of street space to protected public space. Basically, no cars are allowed. These can be phased in or temporary depending on community interests. The time frame is midterm to longer term, and the relative cost is on the higher end. And then the next one is bike and mobility device parking. The idea behind this one is that by providing parking for bicycles, e-bikes, and scooter type devices, nearby residents and visitors will feel more incentivized to not drive and to not park. These can be created in existing on-street parking spaces, and the time frame for this is short to medium term, and the cost varies depending on whether or not you provide curb extensions. And then the final one on this topic is transit curb extensions, and this is about building high-quality transit stops that extend out further into the roadway for better transit boarding. Spaces can be offset in, say, a public parking lot. And again, the time frame is longer term, and the relative cost of this is on the higher end.
Okay. Do you support the conversion of on-street parking spaces for the following reasons? And this one, you can select multiple choices. I would just caveat that if you select no, I do not support, you shouldn't select any of the others.
And as we're doing this, I just want to mention too, because I know we are getting some questions in the A section, and then I think I see a hand up. At the end of this presentation, we will have opportunity for questions and comments from attendees. So we'll address all those once we get to the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Lena.
And if anybody has questions about a particular slide that we've covered, we can keep the slides up and flip back to anything for reference, if that would be helpful. So it seems like we have the most support for bike and mobility device parking and transit curb extensions. We also have a fair amount of support for streetlets, not as much for TNCs and AVs.
Excellent.
All right. Yeah, still a pretty even tie with mobility devices and transit curb extensions.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Okay, seems like we've stabilized. Yeah.
Excellent.
So that concludes the second section of the presentation. Now we're going to move into the final stretch where we're going to talk about best practices that we've identified from other communities. So we looked at jurisdictions all across Southern California, but we paid particular attention to nearby coastal cities because the context in those cities, specifically your neighboring cities, is a lot more similar to the context in Redondo Beach. So things that might be working well there could potentially work well in Redondo Beach as well. So the strategies and best practices that we're going to cover are reviewing and adjusting parking standards over time dynamically, parking benefit districts, park once shared parking, flexible curb space, in-lieu fees, and special parking requirements for certain land uses.
Okay.
But before we dive into those best practices, I want to say a little bit about off-street parking ratios. Don't be intimidated by this table. I know that there's a lot of information packed into it. But the key point is that for any given jurisdiction, the municipal code governs how much parking any given land use needs to provide per square foot. So if we think about an example, think about a commercial development, for example, and let's imagine that it's 1,000 square feet. So if that were located in Redondo Beach, 1,000 square foot commercial development would have to provide 4 parking spaces. If it were located in Beverly Hills, it would have to provide 3. If it were located in the Long Beach coastal zone, it would have to provide 5. And then in Hermosa Beach and Manhattan Beach, there's actually a scale. So the amount of parking that the development has to provide really depends on the size of the project and other contextual factors. But the key takeaway from this is that for most land uses, if you look at the range that's being provided for all these different uses on the left, compared to other jurisdictions, Redondo Beach requires development projects to provide more off-street parking than these comparison jurisdictions. So if what the community wants to see is on-street parking getting converted into off-street parking and kind of freeing up the curb for other purposes, the municipal code is already pretty well set up to help achieve that. But if that's not the goal that the community wants to work towards, then it might be worth revisiting the code to make some adjustments.
Okay.
So we singled out these 3 land uses because these are the most predominant land uses in the Artesia and aviation corridors. So I just wanted to kind of recap and summarize the range of parking requirements that we saw from the previous slide. So for commercial uses, we saw a range from providing 1 parking space per 200 square feet to 1 parking space per 333 square feet. And in Redondo Beach, the requirement is 1 space per 250. For office, the range that we saw was 1 parking space per 250 square feet, all the way up to 500 square feet. And in Redondo Beach, the requirement is different depending on whether it's a general office or a medical or dental office. So for general office, the requirement is 1 parking space per 300 square feet. And then for medical and dental office, it's effectively double that. So 1 parking space per 150 square feet. And then for restaurant, we saw a range from 1 parking space per 50 square feet, all the way up to 350 square feet. So a much bigger range there. And the requirement for Redondo Beach is 1 parking space per 75 square feet. Okay, so our first best practice example. This one comes from Long Beach, specifically the Belmont Shore District. And the actual best practice is special parking requirements. So in the Belmont Shore District, basically parking requirements have been cut in half for the majority of land uses actually. The main exception is sit-down restaurants. Those typically require more parking. And generally when people go out to eat, they want to make sure that they're going to have a place to park when they get there. So that's the one land use that's accepted from the rest of the district. One consideration is that this strategy includes options for in-lieu fees based on square feet. And Marta touched on in-lieu fees a little bit earlier, but basically the idea is that if I'm developing a new project, instead of actually building on-site parking for the project, I would just pay a fee to the city. The city collects that fee from me and presumably other developers as well. And then they pool together that money to build public parking instead of having a lot of private parking. And that's really important because the key consideration for this to work is how that in-lieu fee gets set. Because you want to kind of strike that balance between maximizing revenue generation for the city, but also setting that fee at an appropriate level to discourage developers from building on-site parking. So it's really a matter of calibrating that fee so that both of those goals are being met.
Yeah.
So our next polling question, do you support adjusting Redondo Beach's off-street parking ratios to require less parking? Okay, we're seeing a lot of support.
Mm-hmm.
All right, yeah, a lot less variation in the responses to this one than some of the previous questions that we've seen.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, seems like we've stabilized. So yeah, people generally in support of less parking.
All right, we'll move on. So the next best practice is this one from Santa Ana, the 2021 Downtown Parking Study. And this really focuses on reviewing and adjusting parking standards as needed over time. They look at specific timeframes to gauge what's the parking demand, and based on those findings from their fieldwork, they can determine a new parking rate that fits current needs. One consideration is that it requires data collection over many seasons. The next one is very similar to the one prior, except they're a little bit more focused on what's happening on the curb. For instance, if there are a bunch of people getting dropped off by Ubers and Lyfts where they're not supposed to, if so, maybe we should designate a new drop-off zone there. So that's that kind of consideration. This approach also relies on community surveys and input. And again, like the last one, it requires extensive data collection over many seasons.
Okay. Do you support dynamic monitoring and adjustments for parking flexibility? So we're really talking about kind of ongoing data collection and monitoring to see what the trends are, what's happening at the curb, and then adjusting parking standards and implementation accordingly to match what's actually happening on the ground. All right, 100% support.
You jinxed it.
I spoke to
Nico and Marta, is there technology that can do this monitoring? You know, how? Do you have any comment on that?
That's a good question. Definitely.
I know we have a question kind of related to that. One of the questions I was looking at them had to do with, you know, is there an app or something that could identify for drivers where available parking is, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's out there.
Yeah.
You know,
I've definitely seen more of that with parking garages. You know, a lot of times you see the electronic occupancy signage that tells you exactly how many spaces are available and where. Sometimes that's provided through an app. It's less common in my experience to see that with on-street parking, but that's not to say that it's not possible.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Moving on.
Yeah, seems like we've stabilized here.
Okay. So sorry, the lights went off in my office. A little dark on my end, but the next one is In-Lieu fees from Santa Monica and Beverly Hills. And as mentioned, this was already mentioned before in the AACAP, but this is when developers pay into a general fund, a parking district fund, instead of building parking themselves. This can allow for improving shared parking and greater flexibility for smaller parcels in the corridors. A couple of considerations include making sure that the fee levels are balanced enough to where developers won't build on site, and being wary that revenue can hinge on occurring redevelopment.
All right, for future projects, do you support an option to pay into a municipal parking fund instead of building parking?
I think we had a question in our Q&A kind of related to this. There was a question regarding if there's already a plan, or if we have an idea how many parking structures would be supported in the corridor.
That's a great question. I'm not sure offhand if there are already existing plans for that. I think to determine the number of parking structures that could be funded through a fee like this, it really depends on kind of what level the fee is set. What's the price per square foot for a development, for example. And that would determine what's feasible based on the amount of money coming in.
And it looks like Councilmember Obaji has his hand up. So,
Sorry, what is the price per parking spot charged by other municipalities like Santa Monica? If you know, or what's the estimate on what would?
I don't know offhand, but I can find out.
Yeah.
I can chime in a little bit. I came from a jurisdiction that had something similar to this, and they essentially use a calculation that takes into consideration building materials, cost of labor, things like that. And on average, I mean, this is average because it changes month to month, you know, the supply and the cost of building materials. It's about $30,000 a stall. So it's quite substantial if someone wants to get out of building parking on their site in order to pay for parking stalls in a garage. That's roughly what it would cost the city to build it. So we would charge the developer likewise.
Yeah, parking is expensive.
Yeah, very.
Yeah. All right.
Seems like we've stabilized here. Majority support.
Great. I'll move on. So our last measure are parking benefit districts, and this is an example from Pasadena. So what is a parking benefit district? They basically help fund improvements where the revenue is generated. For instance, if there were parking meters, the dollars collected from them would only be reinvested in the corridors, nowhere else. This particular strategy has been credited with revitalizing Old Town Pasadena. For instance, the funds from their parking meters were used to make sidewalk improvements, landscape improvements, and so on and so forth. Something like parking meters can potentially be more supported if their revenues end up within the community they are serving. And a couple of considerations include that they require extra management and administration, and that their revenue can fluctuate with seasonal demand.
Okay, do you support creating a parking benefit district? All right, we're seeing a fair amount of support here.
we do have a question related to like if for these like in lieu funds, are the funds usually dedicated to that particular area? Do they stay within the area that they are acquired from?
They can be, yeah. They don't necessarily have to be set up that way. There definitely are cases where there's an in lieu fund that funds parking structures citywide. But if one were created for these corridors, it could certainly be tailored so that that money is being reinvested in the corridors.
Nico, real quick on the parking benefit district, you might know this too, Greg. Is that something that is a zoning overlay, or is this a completely financial mechanism that would just, how are these parking benefit districts, I guess, formalized?
Yeah, I guess they could be done as a zoning overlay. I've seen that before.
Okay, okay.
We could definitely do some research into kind of the range of ways that they've been implemented. I'm sure that there are pros and cons to each. So,
okay.
Okay, I think we've leveled off at 22 answers, and we're still seeing majority support for parking benefit districts.
Right.
And would you support parking meters if their funds were reinvested in the corridors? I know nobody loves to pay for parking, but sometimes feel better about it when you know exactly what the money is going to fund. Okay, pretty much in line with the previous question, majority support, even more support actually. Okay, any final responses? All right, let's keep going. Okay, so that basically concludes the presentation. Just to recap what we covered, we started with a discussion of the recent parking study that was conducted. We talked about the existing supply, and then we walked through a few different potential future scenarios for what demand could look like, depending on different assumptions. We talked about the parking and mobility measures that have come directly out of the AACAP, presented a little bit more detail about what those entail and collected feedback along the way. And then we talked about best practices from other jurisdictions, many of which are your direct neighbors, and polled you a few times to find out how you feel about those measures as well. So in terms of next steps, so currently we're collecting community feedback. So this has been a part of that. As was mentioned previously, all of the polling questions that we went through tonight, those are going to be posted online in a SurveyMonkey. So still more of an opportunity to provide input and weigh in. Once we collect all of that feedback, that's going to be presented to City Council in early June. And then following that, what we'll work on is proposed parking zoning amendments. And the plan is to bring those to Planning Commission this summer and then to City Council probably late summer, early fall. So with that, we will take questions and comments. I see that there's a lot of activity in the chat box, so we're available.
Yeah, so I'll try and organize a little bit of the questions and comments. So for those attendees, if you'd like to ask a question or have a comment, if you can use your raise hand function, and then we'll call you one at a time. I know this isn't like a formal commission meeting or council meeting, but we tend to limit the comments to 3 minutes, just so everyone kind of has an opportunity to ask their question or say their comment, and then we can always come back around to someone as well. So and then Sean, I think you were going through some of the Q&A questions as well, correct?
Yeah, do we want to go through the questions that have already been logged first?
Let's do that, and then maybe you'll give the opportunity for the attendees to find their raise hand function, and then
yes, and in the meantime, I think or maybe first off, we have Councilmember Obaji with a raised hand, and if you want to recognize him, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. I didn't necessarily need to go first, but one thing I wanted to encourage our consultants is not to think of parking, and it seems like pretty bad, but right now we don't have business and we need to get business. One idea that was put out to us by one of the consultants was make a parking holiday for a year where no business has parking. We have an inventory of how much on-site and off-site parking already exists on our boulevard and is vacant. And we essentially credit against, but there's no environmental impact. We credit the new businesses that are coming in, since they don't have to add new parking. There's a holiday, them against the existing extra inventory that we have on our Boulevard. Now, at some point that fills up, and we have new businesses and we have a bunch of new revenue and the like, and maybe we can go to back to our regular parking standards or a different lesser parking standard that still adds more parking to our inventory. And so that's kind of what I wanted to just mention is if we can look at a strategy that really aggressively targets development early on, and then basically slows down development or requires more parking or more contributions to parking later as we get more businesses and dollars into the corridor. That's
a good point. We will note that. Thank you.
So we do have a member of the public with their hand up, Glenn Suarez, I believe, and I'm sorry if I say it incorrect, but Glenn, if you want to go ahead and unmute. Hi, Glenn, are you there? I know you had your hand up for a little bit. Okay, maybe we'll come back around to you. Kathy Wonderly? Kathy, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, my question was how the analysis takes into account the neighborhood environment and people being interested and willing to walk to the corridors for things like restaurants and gathering places, not necessarily shops. And since the corridors have generally had, more businesses, shops where you might want to drive and pick up, your materials or whatever you're going there to get, perhaps if we had more restaurants that people could walk to, we wouldn't see quite the spike in demand that you would expect maybe in other areas. And has that been taken into account at all?
Well, we actually can incentivize restaurants with certain, let's say, relaxations of parking requirements to allow them to come into spaces now they couldn't currently occupy with our standards. It's so I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but through the we know from the AACAP study that we did that a preferred land use is sit-down restaurants. So through these zoning ordinance amendments we're going to do, the intention is to incentivize that land use into the corridor. So the mechanisms we have in the planning department are to, kind of like levers, tighten and loosen restrictions for a particular land use in order to, let's say, disincentivize it or incentivize it. So we're looking at for that land use, sit-down restaurant, as well as professional office, medical or professional office. Those, through the analysis and the work we did and the outreach we did for the AACAP, those were the identified preferred uses. So through this process, we'll, as we do the amendments to the zoning ordinance to make it consistent with AACAP, make adjustments that would make it incentivize, so to speak, those land uses. And parking is one of the keys to incentivizing that land use.
Thank you. That's great. I appreciate that, and I think that I've understood that parking is a barrier to improving the corridors to be for the community use. And so I'm glad to see that we're doing this in hopes that we can improve what I think could be just a really amazing place in our neighborhood.
Great, excellent.
And just to note that one of our analysis, when we were talking about a lower parking demand future, we did consider walking, biking, and taking transit as one of the key factors in driving down parking demand.
Okay, so I see Jim Hannon, you have your hand raised. Jim, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you for your time. It was a very interesting presentation, and thank you, Mr. Boyd, for all the data. I love data as an ex-engineer. But I wanted to tell you that I actually was raised in the Belmont Shore area, so I was really perked up when I saw the photographs of Belmont Shore and the comparison. And I've always seen that exact comparison, actually. And when I lived in Belmont Shore or in that area, I also was a big advocate for more walking and biking infrastructure. And one of the things that we advocated, in particularly Belmont Shore, is we had an alarming collision rate. I mean, with pedestrians and bicyclists. And based on that, we basically took the slow lane and marked it as Cheryl's, which probably wasn't as good as a class 2 bike lane, but it certainly slowed traffic down and reduced the fatalities, reduced the collisions. But in addition to that, because of the slower speeds, it also reduced the severity of the collisions. And so I would like to take that as a lesson learned and maybe, at least apply that to Artesia Boulevard. I think it has merit. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Question here regarding, it said early in the presentation, it was noted that parking is underutilized. Isn't parking basically being underutilized a reflection of vacancies of the businesses?
That's certainly possible. I mean, the data that we relied on was pre-pandemic. So
Yeah.
we're not taking into account any vacancies or underutilization that would have resulted from that. But vacancy is certainly a possible contributing factor to why we observe that.
We do have another hand raised. Sheila Lamb. Sheila?
Thank you. Just to reiterate what Jim has said, the traffic is one of the bigger impediments to enlivening the boulevard. One is that the cars are going so extremely fast. They're going over the speed limit, as we all know. It's across the city. But it's an impediment for people because of this traffic, because of the speed. It's an impediment for having people to come or inspiring people to come to the street. So, and thirdly on this, one of the benefits of the village around Catalina Boulevard, Catalina Avenue, is that it does have that one big parking lot. And you can park in that parking lot and you can go anywhere on the Riviera Village street and the businesses and restaurants there. So those are just 3 points that I think address some of the challenges that Artesia has, not just the parking, but these traffic issues and the speed, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And looks like is it Obaji has his hand up again? Go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Just one last quick question.
Of course.
Is when you talk about potentially moving a parking spots on the street for a bike lane, would you guys consider? Have you ever seen before a city do that and put both directions of the bike lane in lieu of one parking? One set of the on-street parking rather than removing both sides of the street?
Yeah, like having a bi-directional.
Does that make sense? That question makes sense at all? Right. And is that something that you could do on a busy commercial street like Artesia Boulevard with some sort of protection?
Yeah, I mean, it would require analysis to determine what the impacts to traffic, to safety, all of that would be. It also depends on the roadway width and how much capacity is available. In some cases, if you have maybe a narrower roadway and you try to implement something like that, it ends up creating more congestion. So it would require analysis, but it's certainly possible.
Okay, and have you guys analyzed at all which side of the street has more off-site parking?
Oh,
No.
probably have that in your survey, Nico.
We might.
Yeah. We have parking data available on a parcel level basis, so that is something that we could look
Okay,
into.
yeah, if you guys could just give that to the city at some point, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
It looks like Jim Hannon might have had something to say maybe about the bicycle lanes, I'm assuming. Jim?
Yes, of course. Sorry. Well, I think it was a good suggestion, by the way, but, one of the things that it creates is, a kind of a bi-directional bike lane that goes both directions, and it's usually 4 feet on each side at least, which seems like a good idea, and often it's protected. It could be protected by ballards, it could be protected by parked cars. And the parked car is closer to the center of the lane and protecting the cyclist. But one of the things that we really need to be conscious of is the design, because often cyclists also want to change lanes. They want to turn left across the intersection. So how do they do that? So we need to, if we decide to go that way, we definitely need to show special attention at the 4-way intersections and how we handle that.
Mm-hmm.
It does have merit, though. So thank you again.
Okay. We do have another hand raised, Miriam Butler. Miriam, if you want to unmute, you can go ahead.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to express my gratitude to all of you for providing this presentation and asking all of us for our input and giving us an opportunity to speak, because this has been something that those of us who live near Artesia in District 4 and District 5 have really been wanting for a long time, is just more restaurants, places that we can walk to so that we can spend our money and not have to travel far. For example, a lot of us, we go to Hermosa or we go to Manhattan Beach, we spend our money on restaurants there. I love that we have Bergino's. I'd love to see more places like Bergino's where we can go to a sit-down place, and even better to have places where we can bring our kids. Something like a Slice and Pint in El Segundo is what comes to mind. So my point is this makes me feel really hopeful that we're going in that direction, and I'm really excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that's all the hands for now.
Do you want to go through some more of these questions that we already got, Lena?
Yeah, Sean, did you?
Yeah, I mean, the first one we have from Doug Boswell, doesn't this depend maybe to a large degree where the off-site parking is located and how far one would need to walk? I think he's referring to, like where we would actually locate a parking garage if the city was going to take that route and invest in something like Sheila was talking about in the village. And we do, we have at the Southern California Edison, we've developed some parking lots. They're kind of on one end of our corridor. I think it really, the success of it would have to really be strategically located, I would think. And I think in your presentation, you were speaking to it like some walking distance for like a quarter mile.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have a lot of, let's say, we're talking about, I can't recall the length of our corridor, but it's I want to say close to a mile. So to have a parking site, city garage, that's one of the impetus for the activity nodes. We're trying to kind of target smaller areas that would be consistent with that walkable node and create some energy at that activity node. And we've got 2 of those. And I think actually the parking that we have on the right of way is kind of on the end of one of those parking nodes. So we've kind of, which is over by McKay. McKay and Artesia is kind of the eastern activity node, and I think the parking structure on the SCE right away is on the edge of that. So we've kind of covered one. The other one is at Green Lane in the intersection of Artesia. That's our other activity node, which we kind of were building it around the library, the community services center. So, we've got kind of some civic synergy there, energy, and then we get some restaurants and, really try to target more restaurants in that area. Maybe there's a lot the city could pick up that would kind of cover that location. So yeah, it really is dependent. I think the success of the parking structure, they have somewhat of a limited range. So I think targeting specific areas to kind of create some energy is kind of what the AACAP fleshed out. The next question, Kent Adams, what if we get rid of the bulb outs? It's kind of, I don't know where our survey landed on that, Nico. I think that was one of our strategies.
Yeah, we were talking about those transit curb extensions, and those seem to get a lot of support.
Yeah, I think they did. They kind of have a traffic calming effect. To some degree.
They do.
Okay. The next one I have is, what does that do for 55 over condo for curtailed outside parking? That was by Latanya Portlock. I'm not sure. I mean, we have much different parking standards for 55 and over. They're much more relaxed. I think it's a 1 parking space per unit, as opposed to what we have for multifamily, which is 2 plus some guest parking. So I'm not sure where that question is going. And then Sheila's question about the technology available that allows for notification of free spots. I think we talked about that. It sounds like we're going to do a little bit of research on those technologies, Nico.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Somebody said they couldn't vote. So for those that had some technical difficulties, we'll be putting this on our website as a Survey Monkey, so you'll get an opportunity to go online on the city's website. We have an AACAP landing page. Where is that, Lena, on the Community Development Department?
Yeah, so actually you can just go to www.redondo.org, and it's /AACAP. And then at the end of the meeting too, I have a little sheet but it's .org /AACAP. And then we'll have a link. It'll go live tomorrow, and we'll have a link to the Survey Monkey from that landing page.
Excellent. Laura Caputo had a question about how many garages are we talking about. I think I addressed that. The way the AACAP set up, we're really, and of course it applies to the whole corridor, but we're the program, the implementation plan for the AACAP is to really try to go after a few blocks on the east and west end of the corridor. So at the most, 1 garage is kind of how this would play out, at least initially, if the city was going to go down that path. Let's see, doesn't this depend on a large degree? Okay, that was the same question. Let's see, Latanya Portlock, you need to table extension until you can have seniors and elders. Some questions and concerns about seniors and homelessness. Certainly if you have some follow-up questions, you can send them. Lena, they can email us.
Yeah, so you could also, if you have follow-up questions or comments, you can email us. It's planningredondo@redondo.org. All one word, planningredondo@redondo.org. We'll take comments and questions there as well.
Okay, great. Let's see, if we allow this option to pay into a fund, would the funds be dedicated to a certain area? I think we answered that. We could certainly structure, any in-lieu parking fees and or parking meter funds collected to a particular district, in this case, the AACAP area. Okay, a question about large garages. I think we've kind of answered that. Let's see. One of the challenges, okay. Sheila had a comment about challenges of Artesia is the on-ramp for 405. And she wants to know if we're going to hold another workshop that will include traffic issues. And certainly, as this continues down this path, the traffic will, it's basically the defining character now to a degree of the corridor is it's a commuter corridor partly. And one of the dynamic we're trying to evolve the corridor to is neighborhood serving. We've got all the residents, 20,000 residents, I think, live within like a half a mile of the Artesia corridor. So we really, we're trying to open it up to the adjacent residents versus serving the commuter traffic. That's one of the things in zoning ordinance, it could be no more drive-throughs on Artesia Boulevard. That really serves, the commuter. It's not really focused on the neighborhood. So there's a lot of things we'll be exploring over the next few months in terms of amendments to the zoning ordinance and the parking regulation amendments as we move this forward. So there'll be a lot more opportunities to get into this subject. Great workshop. Thank you. We'll have more meetings on this. The two-way bike lane is done down at the harbor. That's what we have, Nico, by the way. We've got that bike lane configuration that Councilmember Obaji referenced.
Yeah.
That's what we have down by the waterfront.
Oh, great. Got it. Ready right there.
Yes. And then incorporate parking into development of the mall. Yes, there's a question about the Galleria Mall. For those that we didn't really go over the boundaries, but the Galleria is outside of the AACAP. It's immediately adjacent to it. It's a project that we're actually initiating a plan check now, the plan check process for the redevelopment of that mall. So that all has to handle its own parking. So that's all I've got on questions that were in our Q&A.
Yeah, I think we do have one more hand up.
Great.
Yeah, Laura Caputo. Laura, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, I was curious if we've identified either businesses that are interested in coming into Artesia and aviation to be there, or is this like if we build it, they will come kind of thing where they're taking? Because I feel like part of what happened on the green path where they put in the new parking, under the power lines, it doesn't seem like that's being used as much as I think it was intended. And so I just am wondering about the landowners and how flexible they are, or how much of an input they've been having in all of this. And, we could build a beautiful garage, but nobody really uses it, if that makes sense. So I guess that's the question. Yeah,
I can tell you one of the things one of my opening remarks were the number of times, and it wasn't a lot, but we turned away businesses. Some, there could have been a restaurant or two, certainly a lot of professional office that helps kind of feed the daily support of restaurants. We turned them away because they couldn't meet parking requirements. So, we're hopeful as we kind of loosen this up and create other incentives for those uses, they will come and they'll kind of create energy once we get, these particularly focused areas in the activity nodes I refer to, one near that SCE parking lot. And we do have, we're talking with a restaurant company on a key lot right in that area that we think would be a really great fit. And it's the restaurant sit down, that some of the examples we've heard, this is in keeping with that. So, if we run into parking issues on that, hopefully we'll have this far enough along to where we can tap into that parking lot over on SCE and not, not get in the way of a use we know everybody wants. Greg, do you have any comments on kind of economic development?
You hit the nail on the head, but I do think it's a combination of both. I think it is, as our caller put it, if you build it, they will come. But once these regulations have been corrected to try to get them to come, I think the economic development department should be putting our best foot forward and getting that out there to the business community in any way and form that we can, so that we're actually trying to get people to come into here. So I think we're obviously in that first phase right now, and once we accomplish that, we can start the second phase, which is getting our information out there. But I do think it's a combination.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Any closing remarks, or how we're right on time, actually.
Perfect.
Yes. Well, I really want to thank everybody who participated tonight. Again, a reminder, we're going to be loading on the website the Survey Monkey version of the polling questions you had tonight. And that'll be up for the next week. And keep an eye on the AACAP landing page. Thank you so much.
I know it's a basic word, but yeah. So basically,
yeah, no, that's perfect.
Yeah, the Survey Monkey will launch tomorrow. You'll just go to redondo.org/AACAP. There'll be a link there. Yeah.
I think that's a wrap.
Yeah.
Nico.
Thanks, everybody.
Marta, yeah. Great job.
Thank you all.
That was really fun. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you,
Take care,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye-bye.